Thank you very much for being here tonight. Today I wanted to tell you about my journey engineering swarms across scale, from the nanoscale to treat cancer to much larger scales for things like warehouse applications or environmental monitoring. So I'm based in engineering mathematics at the University of Bristol, but I also have a home at the Bristol Robotics Laboratory and in life sciences. And you'll see that what I talk about today is very cross-disciplinary. And even though I won't go in detail in the mathematics, what underpins all of this is the mathematical modeling that makes our understanding of swarming possible. So I'm fascinated by systems like these birds. They can do beautiful, complex patterns in the skies. And there's many features that are interesting for real-world applications. For example, if you keep adding birds to the flock continues to fly, so it can scale to very large numbers. If a bird crashes to the ground, the whole flock doesn't crash to the ground, so they're robust to individual failure. And together they can do more than the sum of their parts. For example, they might be better at avoiding predators. And what's fascinating to me is that in this flock of birds, there is no one leader telling every bird what to do. It's the result of every bird following a set of simple rules, looking at its local neighborhood, and these behaviors emerge. So we see examples of swarming all around us, whether it's these flock of birds, or it's ants as they create trails to your picnic table, or it's bees making decisions about their next nest site, or indeed our ability to grow fully functioning human beings from just a couple cells. So as a swarm engineer, my challenge is, given a desired group behavior that we want, given a desired emergent property, how do you go about designing the local rules that give rise to that? And that's really where the modeling comes in, because you just can't wrap your head around it without doing proper modeling. And we do it in two different ways. So one is we use bioinspiration to give us the rules, and then we model whether that would work. And the other is we use machine learning to come up automatically with rules that give us a good desired group behavior. So those are the two different ways we approach it. And I wanted to bring you on this journey from the nano world to the larger world. So let me start with nanoparticles. Nanoparticles are fascinating vehicles. They're nanometer size, and their size makes them useful to deliver drugs directly into certain types of tumors. And these nanoparticles, they work in the 10 to the power 13, so a huge sheer number that you can't wrap your head around easily. And on top of that, you can individually engineer the agents. So you could change the size of these nanoparticles. You could change their shapes. This is an iron oxide nanoworm here that you're seeing. You could change their charge. You could change their materials. Some of these materials are energy receptive, so you could use light or magnetic fields to control them. You could decorate these particles with molecules that allow them to bind on receptors overexpressed on certain cancer cells, and you can load them with these drugs that you release in a more or less controlled fashion. So there's many knobs that you turn on the design of these particles, and depending on how you design these particles, they're going to behave in different ways within the tumor tissue. So for example, we spent a lot of time doing modeling of a simple scenario where you have particles that leak out of a vessel. They need to kill all these tumor cells along the way. And we just turned two knobs, how sticky the particle is and how big it is, which changes how quickly it moves through that tumor tissue. And just those two features could cause the particles to all stick to the first cells they encounter, or to go deep into the tumor tissue. And so the collective dynamics that emerge just from those two knobs are actually really useful to understand if you're trying to design effective treatments for cancer. And since doing that, we've been designing more efficient models, or models that are a little bit more realistic. So here you can see particles moving through a line of cells in simulation and sticking to those cells. And at the bottom, you see little tumors on a chip that we make in our laboratory. And in green and blue, you see real nanoparticles moving through a little artificial tumor chip, so that we can compare between the simulated world and the real world. We also have a game to design these nanoparticles and crowdsource this from the public. So in this game, we teach people about the tumor cells, about the healthy cells. People can inject these particles with different dosages at different times. You can combine different particles. You can change the size of these particles, and that changes how quickly they move. Some of these cancer cells have receptors, and you can make a particle with a shell that binds to those receptors with a certain strength. You can load those particles. You can make a smart material where if you activate a particle, it will release something in its environment, and particles can self-assemble and disassemble to become bigger, smaller, which makes them faster or slower. So all of these things, if you're a roboticist, you take a step back and you realize, actually, we have the ability to control the motion of these particles, their ability to impact their environment by releasing something. That thing they release could impact another particle. So all of a sudden you have communication. And although you can't make them go fast or slow, you can somehow, or you can't make them go left or right, you can somehow make them speed up or slow down. So those are a lot of the building blocks we actually use in the swarm world. And we're considering what behaviors we could make that would be a little bit more clever. And this is an example of what it might look like in this crowdsourced tool. So since then, we have a European project that allows us to scale this up, that basically given a problem in the sphere of cancer, automatically optimize nanoparticles by looking across different scales from how does the nanoparticle move through the body, how does it move through the tissue, and then how does it go into specific cells, and optimize this computationally before we produce this with collaborators and test them in vitro or in vivo. All right, so that dive into the nanoscale made me realize that swarms, actually, this idea of things working together, when you go to tiny sizes of agents, you end up with huge numbers of them. And it's really interesting to think of these in terms of collective dynamics. And there's many examples of that at the tiny scale. So whether it's cancer cells and their ability to escape a primary tumor and go to a metastatic site, or the ability of bacteria to become resistant to antibiotics, or whether it's our ability to create interesting smart materials. So then we thought, well, you know, what if we could control these microagents a little bit better, a little bit more than what we could do with our nanoparticles? Could we control bacteria? Could we control cells? Could we control, you know, microrobots? And so we thought we needed help to do that. And we built a system which we call the DOME, for Dynamic Optical Microenvironment. And really all it is a projector, and this projector has thousands of pixels, and each one of these pixels shines light on an area as big as a cell. So we can basically shine loads of different light patterns, and then we can see what happens under those light patterns. We could be looking at cells moving, for example, and change what we project as a result of that. So we can close the loop and start controlling swarms of microsystems to make them do things that are clever. And so here what you're seeing is a proof of concept. So here we have little algae that are micro-sized. And here in this instance, these algae, we're projecting little light halos around them. So we're augmenting the capabilities of these algae to communicate. And now you can see this blue is propagating through the algae community, basically being communicated from algae to algae. Here, what you see are algae that are depositing light trails, a little bit like ants might deposit little chemical trails behind them to guide other ants. And here you see our ability to control the motion of these algae, basically stopping them in their track when we illuminate them. So again, all these building blocks that we typically use in the world of swarm control, but applied to little tiny agents. So you might have heard that I work in robotics, and all of this does bridge to robotics. We've been wondering how we could design robot systems different in light of how things organize at the micro and the nanoscale. So for example, if you imagine farm fields and you want to make a robot that plants seeds, you would typically make a robot tractor that zigzags through this farm field, planting seeds one after the other. But if you think about how things world in the micro nano world, maybe you'd change your approach. Maybe you would design hundreds of thousands of little robot seeds that buzz around that farm field, plant themselves, and then biodegrade there. And so this idea of huge numbers of robots, but with very simple behaviors, is actually something that works. So here what you're seeing is 100 of our coin-sized robots. We have 1,000 of them at the Robot Lab. And they start with very random motions, but they're looking for this object in the upper right corner. And as soon as they find it, these trails get created. And for those that are familiar with it, this is basically an edited version of diffusion limited aggregation. But simple rules, random motion, local communication, and yet we are able to find things in the environment, and they can avoid obstacles. They do all sorts of clever things for free. I know this is noisy. That's the actual noise of 400 robots. Here they're deciding between blue and red. Blue is the better decision. This is based on how honeybees make decisions, and it works quite consistently, blue and red, and over time converges to blue. And here what you're looking at is our swarm doing morphogenesis, basically growing shapes. So they start as a blob, and then each one of these robots pretends to be a cell, exchanges virtual chemicals with its neighbors, and Turing patterns emerge from that. So you might have noticed, and you'll see it here, that spots arise on that swarm. You can see them here, those green spots. Those are basically Turing patterns. And so you get lots of features for free in that you can chop up the swarm and it'll regrow, you can split it and it'll heal itself. So all of these things are the result of very simple random motion, local exchanges, sometimes directly imitated from these biological systems or chemical systems. And if you think of hundreds or thousands of robots doing these very simple things, you then need to think about, okay, well, how would we produce these robots? And so this is our first attempt at a robot that basically is able to jump a set number of times, but is built without any electronics. And so maybe we can kind of start moving in that direction of biodegradable robot solutions. All right, so I mentioned the bio-inspiration and the exploration, as in using machine learning to design things. And the robots that you've seen here so far have been minimal robots, very simple. You know, we focus on the number to achieve complex things. But there's also a whole space where actually our robots work in smaller numbers, but each robot is smarter. And so what you're seeing here is a swarm called the teraflop swarm. And these robots have a GPU on board. And what this allows us to do is essentially run a machine learning technique called artificial evolution on board. And really what they're doing is they start from not knowing how to push this frisbee to one side of the arena to figuring it out in the space of around 15 minutes. And that doesn't require any other system or computer external to that swarm to do it. So you could, in theory, you could put them on Mars and let them figure out how to do something, although all of this is still very much toy scenario lab based. And the exciting thing with these learned controllers is that the way they're programmed, or what they evolve, the thing they discover is a behavior tree. And that's what a behavior tree looks like. And we're excited about this because they're human readable. So we can really navigate this as a human and understand what happens. We can kind of, color code things, and it just allows us, even though the automatic solutions happen, by themselves, we can read them and gain confidence that these systems make sense. So this has been very much lab-based so far, and I think we start to have the tools now to make, sophisticated hardware in large numbers, models, the algorithms that allow us to do things that are useful. And so it's now time, at least in my team, to shift to making swarms for people. And one thing that we need to figure out to start with is how do we interact? Ooh, okay, that's sped up. I'm not going to play that video because the sound is going to be a little bit tricky for you. But how do we make these swarms easy to interact with as a human observer? Because it's hard to interface with swarms, and it's hard to read out the information from the swarms. So here what you're seeing is a display, and the swarm as a whole has users interact with it, so we can paint on them. They can display an image, so we can read out the state of the swarm by looking at it. And we're basically exploring creative ways of working with swarms as human in a more intuitive way. What we also did is a use case study looking at different uses of swarms. So one was, would swarms be useful for storage and retrieval? The other was, would swarms be useful for firefighting? And the third was, could we use swarms to inspect structures? And we interviewed loads of people for this, and actually people were excited, which was the good news. They didn't say, ooh, swarms are terrifying. They were quite excited, but there's always the but, as long as we get it right, as long as we make them trustworthy, as long as they're easy to use. And so those are some of the considerations we're taking into account. We also designed an escape room and had loads of people try to break out of our little escape room by solving swarm puzzles. And in the process, we asked them what they thought swarms should be used for, and they had lots of different ideas. Some odd ones like massages, but some that we'd already been thinking about, like construction, search and rescue, or nuclear cleaning. And we also do a lot of science communication in this area. So these are two nonprofits that I run called RoboHub and AI Hub that help explain what's happening in the robotics field to the general public. So with this in mind, we've started to make robots that are intended to work alongside humans. So this one here is a decision helper. So the idea is that we're building 100 of these little robot screens on wheels, and they're meant to help people in crowds that are trying to make decisions communicate opinions over a longer range. So typically before COVID, you'd cluster in little groups and you'd have a chat, and maybe it's always the same person that's talking. And so can robots, through their physical presence and movement, help mix opinions and share opinions and kind of change the dynamics in deliberative democracy? We have a project with the company Wind Racers to think about how drones could be used for fire monitoring and mitigation or aid delivery. We have a new project where we're building a swarm of robots to monitor basking sharks. So they're meant to look at the structure of their jaws to understand something about their materials. And for the past couple of years, we've been building up swarms for industrial logistics. And there the idea is, unlike big companies like Ocado or Amazon might have the abilities to deploy robots because they can put in the infrastructure, we think swarms would be useful as out-of-the-box solutions. Where you don't need to retrofit your warehouse, where you don't need to put a large upfront cost or research and development effort. But ideally, these systems would be very simple, very reactive, but would still do the job if you need to organize space. And here's just a little teaser of what our current latest swarm looks like. And we're building a new industrial test bed at the Bristol Robotics Laboratory to house 20 of these robots to help us think about their deployment in real world settings. All right, so as we do this, then it raises questions about the safety of the robots. Do they make sense in these real world environments? And I think part of it is we're going to have to change the way people think about them. But I think we're getting there. I think that, there's so many areas where I think swarm makes sense. Maybe it's my biased view of it. And I think we're at the stage where we need to make that happen. So this is very much a team effort across a lot of different institutions that I've been at throughout my career, as well as a large group of PhDs and postdocs and collaborators. So as you've probably noticed, this is all very cross-disciplinary. And so for each time you see a nanoparticle or you see the microsystems or indeed the robots, but in different applications, all of those have wonderful collaborators that help us work through it. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Sabine. We have one question already, and that question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge to understanding what is possible that mathematics can help to answer?
Here's a good example. For the way we approach this now is very much using agent-based simulations, which take a lot of time. And for some of these things, we're dealing with random walkers. We're interested in understanding how much area they can cover. We're interested in understanding how many exchanges we can expect to happen in a certain amount of space. And I think for a lot of these, it would be interesting to have a theoretical mathematical formulation for the solution that would go much quicker in terms of if you want to parameterize the behavior of your robot for a warehouse of a certain size with a certain number of boxes. If we had a way to formalize that, and to get those parameters without having to run the simulations, I think that would be really instrumental in helping us.
Okay. I had a question myself, but before I ask that, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A session just down at the bottom. That's where I'm reading the questions, and so then I'll be able to ask the speakers. My question was, you mentioned how the likes of companies like Amazon and Ocado, they have their, I'm not particularly familiar with it, but I've seen videos of their warehouses where they've got robots which go up and down, basically rails, and it's all set out very much on a grid. Now, the question I have, and you've sort of alluded to it, is that's happening, but obviously involves a huge amount of investment. Is something you're trying to do to not just make it easy that you can purchase robots out of the box, but that they're also affordable, so easily accessible to small companies who maybe just have a small warehouse, that size of thing?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the unmet need is the shoe shops, the pop-up food banks, the places that typically wouldn't invest in any automation. And when we interviewed them, they do have this need. There's someone in the back room who's basically figuring out how to do the stock and would much rather be doing something else within the SME. Yes, that is exactly the target market for this, because the idea is that you could, because of the scalability, you could buy one of these robots or two of these robots or three of them, depending on what you want to do and what efficiency you want. And these robots are built to be simple. So they're not relying on a capability to map their environment, for example. Random walks actually do a decent job if you have a small enough space. So even organizing the boxes, the video I had with simulations, I should have highlighted this more, but they were random walks, and actually we get decent times. And I think this idea that robots need to be much clever and need to understand everything about their world like we do to do a task. We're trying to relax. We're trying to make people see that actually they could do a decent job if we let them have a go at it. A little bit like the robot hoovers, the robot vacuum cleaners. The first generation just bounced off walls. But that did a good enough job, I think. So I think we're trying to understand what the trade-offs are.
Excellent. Okay, we've got some more questions come through. I'm just a little time conscious, so I think we'll have time for a couple more. So one of them is, as the interactions increase, I believe that the explainability would be difficult to convey to the non-specialist. How do we go about creating methods to explain this to the general public?
Right, so it's challenging to explain emergent behaviors in general, because you can say the rules. So it goes two ways. So I often explain the rules in my classes, or actually to kids sometimes in more like educational settings, and they kind of get it. They get that these 2-3 very simple rules could give rise to this emergent behavior, but you need to explain it, and it's not always easy to do. So I think there's different ways we're going to need to approach it. One is that we'll need to build systems that are potentially verifiable. We have a new project on this from EPSRC that's looking at how we can make trustworthy swarms. That's a small part of it. And we're looking if we can formally verify some of our behaviors. So the behavior trees, for example, maybe we can check it in a very engineering way that gives us confidence that that system would work. And the other thing that's useful, I think, is that when we spoke to the users, they didn't actually care how it worked. They cared that it worked. Just like you don't necessarily understand how your car works, but you want to make sure that it's a safe car. And so I think there's going to be something about us guaranteeing that it's safe, that will operate within the realms in which we think are reasonable. And we'll need to do this in a way where they can see the state of the swarm, so they can see that it's functioning, or maybe it has any issues, but without breaking it down to the level of the rules.
I think that's a very good answer, and I think that's also something just touched on the final question that I'm going to have time to ask you, which was, is there a way to quantify how fragile or robust a behaviour is, i.e. in the plate pushing game, if one of the robots is defective and starts moving randomly, will the other robots be able to compensate for it, or will the whole system end up in chaos?
Yeah, I love that question, because we assume that swarms are robust because they're all the same. And so in theory, you could remove one and the rest should continue operating because they don't really rely on any one of them being important. So that's the theory. In practice, if one is really malfunctioning, it could drag the whole swarm with it in the wrong direction. And that could be due to a fault of the robot. It could be due to the environment, which is just really funny and it's never been tested in the environment. And it could be due to nefarious actors who are actually trying to skew the behavior of your swarm. So we have a new project, a new PhD student looking at swarm security and how we quantify how safe and robust your system is, and what we need to make sure that we check, because you could also check your neighboring mates. You could check that they're not faulty. It's a little bit like, an artificial immune system somehow. So these are things, as we push things to reality, we have to stop saying they're robust for the sake of it and actually figuring out when they are and when they aren't.
Excellent. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. That's been very enlightening for myself, and hopefully everyone else enjoyed it.